Welcome to another session of the Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Global Summit. I'm Dr. Gita Vade, a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst practicing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in New York City, and I'll be your co-host for this session. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. Welcome, Dr. van der Kolk.
Good to be here. Hi, Gita.
Thank you for joining the summit, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. First of all, I'd like to share a little bit of a background with our audience, although I don't think you need much of an introduction. Dr. van der Kolk conducted the first studies on the effects of SSRIs on PTSD. He was a member of the first imaging team to investigate how trauma changes brain processes and did the first research linking PPT and deliberate self-injury to trauma and neglect. Much of his research has focused on trauma and how it has a different impact at different stages of development, and how disruptions in caregiving systems have additional deleterious effects that need to be addressed. He provides numerous trainings nationally and internationally to the mental health professionals, educators, parent groups, policymakers, and law enforcement personnel. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score, which has been translated into over 35 languages and has well over 150 peer-reviewed scientific articles. Dr. van der Kolk, welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
You know, I have so many questions to ask you. I reread your book, and it never fails to blow me away, the brilliance of your work. Perhaps we could start by discussing how you see trauma, the nature of trauma, and how it impacts both the mind and body.
Well, of course, trauma in Greek means wound, and trauma is an experience that leaves you wounded, that gets you stuck, that overwhelms you. So it's an overwhelming experience that, in the face of which you basically fall apart. And then the big question is, how old are you? Who is there with you? What are the context, etc. So a lot of things can influence whether a bad experience becomes a trauma or not. But the trauma causes a person to get stuck at that moment and feel like it's not over yet. Yeah.
And the way you emphasize it is so brilliant, because you really talk about it as this stacking that stays with you. It's not something that you can recover from by yourself, right?
Yeah, I think this whole notion of memory deconsolidation, which people often talk about in the context of trauma, for most people is not that the big issue. For most people, trauma is an ongoing set of experiences, usually within your caregiving system, where you just get frozen, overwhelmed, and it changes your mind, it changes who you are, it changes how you see the world, it changes how your own physiology, your reactivity to things. So it's not just about a memory. That event actually is over, but something in you makes you relive that event all the time, basically, inside of you.
Well, I'm really happy you bring this up, because I was really struck by this idea of memory that you talk about, because I remember reading about how you were really talking about how memory itself is incredibly unreliable, and that we think of memory as being reliable, and how trauma distorts that even further. Could you elaborate on this whole idea of memory and memory consolidation?
Well, the whole thing, of course, is that memory research is absolutely right, that memories are very fallible and flexible, and memory is a story that you tell people about something that's happened. And the stories get adjusted to the circumstances under which you are under and subsequent life experiences. So memory is extremely fallible. The problem with trauma is that the trauma doesn't get washed away. The memory doesn't go like, oh yeah, I was a little kid, but it happened. It just, you keep reliving it just like it was. So I was just in Holland, and the people published an op-ed against it. Dr. van der Kolk is a dangerous man who believes that traumatic memories don't change. Well, if you don't study traumatic memories, you don't know that traumatic memories don't change. That's the whole problem, is that memories are supposed to change. They're supposed to go like, okay, it's over, happened a long time. But when you get traumatized, you keep experiencing, have the same emotions, the same reactions, the same images as you have always had. So actually the task of therapy is to make it into a memory and not reliving. So that's the nature of trauma. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything about trauma. Yeah.
So you're sort of saying you need to change the trauma into a memory so you can actually have it become unreliable and play with it and distort it, experiencing it.
It's supposed to. A good example I write about in my book is a grand study, the study where George Vaillant and his colleagues, later Bob Bollinger, followed up hundreds odd Harvard freshmen from 1930 to 1942. They went to war, they were tested up to the zoo and everything. 1945, they tested them again. Most of them had been in the Second World War. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, they looked again at how do you remember their war memories. The people who got PTSD told the same story in 1991 as they told in 1945. Wow. Who did not get traumatized told a completely different story.
That is
the normal mind distorts, and the traumatized mind, unfortunately, doesn't.
And the other thing that is so radical, I think, in your bestseller is you talk about how the memories are stored in the body. And not only that trauma is held in the body, but also beyond being replayed over and over, that there's the betrayal of the mind as well, which is almost like a double whammy.
Well, I don't say it's not remembered by the body. That would be scientifically not correct. It's experienced through the sensations in your body. And none of this is original with me. This happens to be Darwin, who says that horrible experiences get expressed in gut-wrenching and heartbreaking sensations. And every language in the world has a word for heartbreaking gut-wrench, because that's how human beings react to really horrible situations. You feel it in your body, and when you get traumatized, those feelings keep coming up and keeping up over and over again, even though the event is long since over. Yeah.
Darwin talked about that?
Yeah, Darwin started with that, yeah.
Oh, that's remarkable.
He's a smart bloke, actually, yeah.
And what about this storytelling business and how the memory kind of almost disregards that knowledge that's in the body, and it kind of tells a different story? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, storytelling that's our social brain. That's what we have different from animals. We make meaning out of things. We tell stories. Most of the stories we tell are probably inaccurate. For example, I'm sure that every tribe in the world from the very beginning had an explanation of why the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And they were always wrong until probably very recently, and we may still be wrong. We never know. But as long as you and I have the same story, we can agree on something, and then we can move on and do other things. So storytelling is very important for as a social function. But trauma doesn't get laid down as stories. Trauma gets laid down in physiological reactions, where the much more primitive part of your brain picks up that I'm in danger, I'm going to die. You don't think that, you experience that. I always encourage people, if you want to know about trauma, hang out with 1 and 2 year olds who don't have language yet and who have catastrophes and who have intense experiences, and they cannot talk about it, but they express it. And what do you do with an upset 1 and 2 year old? You pick them up, you rock them, you hold them in your arm, you shush them, and so you calm that body down. And the notion that you calm the body down is not exactly a central part of Western thinking, Western psychological thinking. But then I hang out in South Africa with Bishop Tutu, and I've been to China a bunch of times, and you see that there's whole other societies that deal with extreme experiences in very different ways. And so first time I went to China, I saw 10,000 people in every park making these weird movements with their arms. And I'm miserable, but China was a tough place at the time. And I go into the park and I make the same movements. And I say, oh, people make these movements because it makes you feel so much better when everything about you. So these are things that I see in Africa, Asia, India, China, But that's something bleeds out of Northwestern European culture, which is basically culture that we continue to live in. And so for us, moving your body, singing and moving is an unusual thing to do. But everywhere else, people deal with trauma and upsetting things by moving and doing things collectively.
But you are really dismantling the notion that we human beings are rational beings, that we have any reliability in our memories and in our ways of, organizing information. It seems like really you're opening up a very different picture of how we are formed. And then, of course, how trauma is held. And it's so interesting because it really flies in the face of what we as psychiatrists and psychologists do to people or trust when we ask people.
Speak for yourself. Who believes that people are rational people? I think that notion went out of the window at least in 2016. That our society went nuts.
Yes.
No, people obviously are not very rational human beings, and they're pushed by emotions. We are emotional creatures. We're symbolic creatures. And if you're Ukrainian, you right now are fighting for your country with Russians. But as an outsider, I can't tell a Russian from a Ukrainian. Mm-hmm. So these symbolic things suddenly become life and death issues. That's how being are. Are we rational? Absolutely not. We're destroying the planet. We probably won't be able to stop it because we're not rational.
So this idea of sitting there and discussing in a sort of rational way what happened to you, obviously you're not a big fan of this kind of approach. Or what do you think about
I'm actually a great fan of people finding language for their internal experience.
Yes.
But that's a very important part. And that's what psychotherapists hopefully are good at. They may not be good at many other things. And there's a mistaken notion among psychotherapists that they have to be a supermarket that can provide all the things necessary for people to heal. But finding a language for your experience and being able to put it in a context is a very important part of healing. But knowing why you're screwed up doesn't make you less screwed up. Now you know why you're screwed up. But it's good to know why you're screwed up, because then you can say, okay, that's where it comes from. What can I do about it? But as long as you don't have a language for it, there's nothing you can do about it. So language is terribly important.
And you're one of the few people I've spoken to who really values so deeply the inner subjective experience and the inner world and have a real interest in that. I mean, I think that's what you're touching on now. Could you tell us more about your thoughts about
I don't think that's unusual either. The only people who seem to have lost track of that are people with an MBA. Because we're basically very intertwined creatures. We live in troops. We don't exist as individuals. We think we do, and our culture in the US particularly, thinks that we are individuals and we have to do it by ourselves. But in reality, we're all intertwined, interdependent on each other, and we spend almost all of our energy on being together with other people. And what psychiatry pathetically has lost is the notion that people drive people crazy. They think that genes drive people crazy. Genes may have a little bit to do with it, but all the research, billions of dollars of research have been done, hasn't really come up with a gene for schizophrenia or bipolar illness or even the most flagrant mental illnesses. And we are still embedded in a social network where our interactions with other people shape our brain, shape who we are. And we are deeply interpersonal creatures. And the solution, of course, of overcoming trauma is also in reestablishing a sense of connection and safety with other human beings, which can be extremely challenging when you have been traumatized or when you live in a society that really has different notions about truth, love, and justice than you do.
You have been such an innovator in the understanding of trauma as well as the treatment of trauma. I'd love to hear about the modalities you have encountered that you have found the most useful, along with your thoughts on psychedelics and how that fits in dealing with trauma.
I don't consider myself an innovator. I'm a physician, and my job as a physician is to do whatever I can to get my patients better. And so there's a tendency in the mental health field for people to become religious fanatics. People say, I'm a Freudian psychoanalyst. I go, so what? Freud is just another guy who lived in Vienna quite a long time ago with some interesting notions and many mistaken notions. But people say, I'm that, and I'm an EMDR therapist. No, you use EMDR as a technique to help your patient get better. And so this religious attitude among mental health professionals, really, what the hell is that about? And so you really look for what is most helpful. That means that you need to know many different things. And so in the 70s and 80s, we were very excited about new drugs. And we thought that drugs were going to be the answer to mental illness. And people were enormously excited for good reason, because there was a fair amount of promise. And so I always try to do research in whatever seems interesting to know for whom it works, for whom it doesn't work. And we did some research on SSRIs, and they were not bad. They were not particularly great either. And so it helped people a little bit. And then we do these brain scans and we discover some things. And then EMDR comes along. What a crazy way of treating people, wiggling your fingers in front of people's eyes. But my patients come back from other people saying, boy, this really changed my life. And so I said, let's study it. And it turns out that wiggling your fingers in front of people's eyes is incredibly helpful for certain forms of trauma and not helpful for other forms of trauma. So you go on, and then we studied yoga, and we studied theater, and we studied neural feedback, how you can rewire your own brain. And then psychedelics came along. And Rick Doblin and Michael Mithofer came to talk to me 15, 20 years ago, because I already had repetition trauma. I said, what do you think, Bessel, for psychedelics for trauma? And I think that's a fantastic idea, because when you get traumatized, your mind gets all constricted and is unable to imagine other ways of being in the world. It destroys your imagination oftentimes, and you get trapped in that very narrow way of being it. Being a child in the 60s, I had my own experiences with psychedelics in college, not too much, once in a while, here and there. And so have many of my friends, some of whom are very, very creative scientists. And so I asked my friends at one point, so you could take psychedelics in college? And they all said, yeah. And I said, so what impact do you think it's had on your life? And each one of my friends, and I would say the same thing, would say, oh, that's probably why I became such a good scientist, because on LSD, I realized that the reality that we live in is just a tiny little sliver of the reality that's out there. A little bit like when you take LSD or other substances, you become like the Webb telescope. Suddenly, you see that the universe is so much larger than what your little mind can hold. And it certainly can see how opening up the mind to new universes could be extremely helpful to get people out of their habits. Because much of mental illness, or whatever you call it, is about habits. Habits of being obsessional, habits of being afraid of certain things, habits of expectations. And so you need to open up the mind. But I also said to Rick and Michael, in 1994, Lester Grinspoon, who was next door in my office, encouraged me to set up a symposium at the American Psychiatric Association, calling back all the LSD researchers to sort of review what had happened. And I told Doblin and Mithofer that was one of the most depressing experiences I've ever had in my life, because all these researchers were sitting there looking depressed and miserable. And they said, this is amazing research. It was criminalized. I wasted my life. I was ostracized from my institution. And I said to Michael and Rick, don't do it, man. It's going to kill you. It's going to ruin your life. The powers against psychedelics are too great to do it. And they said, well, thank you very much for my opinion. And then they went ahead, and they were both very, very nice guys. And when you meet them, you could never imagine it could hurt a fly. But they fought. They fought. They went to court. They had lawyers. They fought the government. They said, we want to study these drugs. And their persistence, and that's why I honor them so much, really opened up the possibility of us now doing the work that we did. And so it's amazing that they continued with it. And then they asked me to be the PI of the principal investigator of the little Boston part of the study. I was immensely grateful because, of course, it's great to be, for me, to be a researcher that really looks at how does it work, for whom does it work, for whom it doesn't work, and look at the details of the experience rather than be just focused on getting people better and remembering your successes but forgetting your failures, which most people do. As a researcher, you look at what works, for whom it works, and for whom it doesn't work. And that is what I love to do. So I was very fortunate they asked me to do that.
Could you explain to the audience who perhaps are not familiar with what MDMA psychotherapy for PTSD looks like?
Well, that's a good question and something we need to really talk about very carefully, because what MAPS, Rick Doblin and Michael Mithoff's outfit did is they made a very careful protocol, in part inspired by the FDA, but also in part of them really understanding the complexities of psychedelics. And so you meet with people 3 times for an hour and a half, a team of 2 people. And you talk about your life, you talk about your intentions, and you talk about what gets in the way and why you would want to be in this very complex research study where you have a 50% chance to not get active medication. So it's quite a sacrifice on the part of the participants. But you meet intensively, and after 4.5 hours, you prepare to go and do a whole day of MDMA. So you come in the morning, you haven't eaten, you go off all the medications that you're on, which for some people is quite difficult, and then you sit there for 8 hours, either on placebo or on MDMA, on ecstasy. And all kinds of stuff comes up. And these are people, most of whom have really horrendous histories of trauma, really like the sort of thing that even I, as an experienced and quite optimistic therapist, oftentimes when I hear about a new subject and I study, I go, there's no way this person will get better. There's these long-standing maladaptations and feeling victimized and being in troubled relationships and being unable to stand up for yourself or blowing up at people, have really very, very, very difficult lives. And oftentimes my reaction is, nothing is going to really fix people so quickly. And so people come in for the whole day. They have experiences. They go deep inside of themselves. And what you see clinically is that people go to places that they ordinarily haven't gone to. You lie with eye shades on their eyes. So you really block out the internal world. So you go inside and pay attention to yourself. And as that happens, oftentimes very difficult things come up. And when people say, well, it shuts off the amygdala is sort of the part of your brain that gives you danger signals, I don't think that's entirely true either, because you still experience the danger and the fear and the pain of what happened. That comes to mind back then. But somehow, both the medicine and the set and the setting make it possible for you to tolerate going to these very dark places. And I think that's really, to my mind, the great secret of psychedelics is that they won't take your pain away and they won't obscure the reality of what's going on with you, but there is something about them that makes it possible for you to feel these feelings and to experience the memories, experience the images, the body sensations, and to go, yeah, this is what really happened to me. And then have your mind automatically come up with new perspectives and new things. They don't come from the outside, they come from inside. So a very profound part of the whole psychedelic experience is the activation of the inner healer. And that's really, time and time again, an extraordinarily moving and beautiful process when people who have had terrible lives start opening up new possibilities and new perspectives inside themselves. And what is striking about it is that the therapist is not really a part of instilling that. It is really, you open, what you do as a therapist, you create a setting where people can discover things. But as a therapist, you don't put anything in there except for maybe a little bit of a sense of safety by touch at the right moment, in the right places, and maybe by the sound of your voice, because people, of course, are incredibly sensitive to the sound of angry or kind voices. Mm. And so when you go through a dark place and you hear a kind voice, not what you say, but how you say it becomes important. And if you feel like you're being accompanied, then it makes it safe for you to explore new possibilities inside of yourself. And so it's a very inner process. So part of why, one of the many reasons that this is so exciting, is that our culture, of course, is not a very introspective culture. It's not a culture where people go inside or where people have long histories of going into the wilderness and meditating about their lives. And the psychedelics really open up what human beings since time immemorial have done, is a journey inside to explore the deep recesses of the creatures that we are in order to acquire new truths about ourselves.
I love the way you describe that, because you also capture this really tender process and sort of gentleness of the experience. And I think the artistry of it in the way you're describing it.
Yeah. And that's really what it is. And of course, one of the great worries, I'm not sure if you have it as much as I do, but I sure do, because I had some bad experiences, is that when it gets all commercialized, as it's already beginning to happen with ketamine, then people mainly are interested, how do we make as much money as we can? And they set up infusion centers where people come in and sit in little cubicles, nobody pays attention to you, and there is no setting. People get their little stuff like a mechanical device and they leave again. And we go like, no, that's not what we should do. Don't blow your mind in a little cubicle by yourself. Don't blow your mind in a room by yourself after somebody sends you very powerful substances in the mail. No, these are dangerous substances. They do blow your mind in a way, and you're not really quite in charge of yourself when these drugs come. And somebody needs to be there to watch over you. It's a little bit like you don't let a 1-year-old play in the balcony without railings, without some serious supervision.
So you're really worried about that?
Oh, very worried about it. I think we're living in a honeymoon period, and I think we'll see a lot of crap coming our way.
Could you share with us some of the findings you've had? I think your group in particular have done a lot of work with the MDMA. Yeah. What have you discovered from
so I came into the study after it already had started, and I brought in the perspective that still, to my mind, strangely is a minority perspective in the field. And that the perspective is that we started off studying trauma on the basis of soldiers going to war and adult rape victims. And then we really started to look at who our clinical populations are. And they're people who, by and large, got traumatized within the context of their caregiving systems early on in life. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of research has been done, not primarily by me, but by people like Marty Teicher, Carlos Reis-Ruth, Mitras Bibi, Colin Tavares, attachment researchers who really show the devastating impact of insecure attachment and growing up being scared of your own caregivers. And that is, and we call it developmental trauma. We did the most elaborate field trials for DSM-5 on 40,000 kids to show the reality of psychological adaptations to that constellation of problems, and they rejected it. So that means that the majority of psychiatric patients still get nonsense diagnoses because the majority of our patients suffer from developmental trauma, i.e. really disruptions of our attachment system. But because we have this trauma diagnosis, we keep focusing on what happened to you. Tell me about that memory. But the issue is not one of memories. The question is, who talked to you? Who was there for you? Who made attention to you? Who made you feel safe? And that's a whole other dimension. And so, as it focused on the pure PTSD and the event stuff, and we came up with very effective treatments like EMDR. But when it comes to being raised by a person who goes in and out of jail, who goes in and out of rehab programs, who has a horrendous trauma history and gets violent and angry and upset and withdrawn, we don't really know how to treat it. And I think anybody who says, oh, we know how to treat it, really should not be trusted. I think this is an extremely complex beginning of our life experiences that we don't know at this point how to reliably heal and take care of. And so with that understanding, which is based on very solid data, I entered the study and I said, we need to have some measures for self-experience. And I also said we need to have some measures of caregiving systems, which we did not put in at the end, which is too bad. But it turned out that, and I said to MAPS, you should really not include people in the study who have never felt safe with anybody, who don't suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, but they suffer from lifelong trauma stress disorder and where there is no imprint of safety. And I was overruled. And sometimes it's wonderful to be overruled and be a scientist, because it turned out that the vast majority of our subjects were people exactly who did not have post-traumatic stress disorder, who had always been traumatized from the onset. And 3/4 of them got much, much better.
Wow.
And that has never happened before. That is truly, the talk about PTSD, saying it's unique for PTSD, no. There's many things you can treat PTSD with. But developmental trauma, this identity of I'm unwanted, I'm defective, there's something fundamentally wrong with me, I don't belong here on this earth, nobody will not feel safe with anyway, that dimension got dramatically affected.
Well, that's absolutely radical. How do you think that works? How do you think about or theorize that can actually be accessed and healed in a psychedelic setting?
See, to my mind, something happened, and I was very much part of that also in psychiatry, is that psychiatry got to believe that the technological means they had at their hands can explain very complex psychological phenomena. And the headquarters of that notion was actually my old training hospital in Bessel, where I said, oh, norepinephrine is the cause of this, and serotonin is the cause of that. It turned out that was all wrong. It's not a bad hypothesis back then, but the notion that a chemical process can explain mental processes is, maybe someday we'll get there, but it's bullshit at this point. Tom Insel just came out. Tom Insel was the head of NIH for 15 years, and he put all his money into genetic research and biological research. He said, billions and billions of dollars. We found nothing of clinical practice. So don't ask me to explain the profound effect of psychedelics by simple chemical substances. And if you do, I will lose all respect for you immediately. What we need to do is to go back to understanding mental processes. Mm-hmm. And that has disappeared from our field, almost.
Yes.
So one of the early research I did in trauma, for example, used the Rorschach. And the Rorschach is completely out of fashion now. But the Rorschach is an extremely well-validated instrument. You show people a colored ink blot, sort of shapeless, and you say, what do you see here? And human beings are meaning-making creatures. And so we all see something. Almost all of us see something. If you don't see something, you're in the worst trouble. And what we found is that when you're traumatized, you see particular things and you focus on particular colors or shapes that put you in the direction of that your emotions want to show. You cannot analyze things that tell you something about your relationship to the world around you, how helpless you feel. So the Rorschach is a beautiful way of measuring psychological processes. I also studied extensively, not with Piaget himself, but with a student of Piaget. So I learned a lot about mental development. Mental development is not like your 4-year-old have more serotonin or more GABA receptors than your 2-year-old. No, there's a new wiring that happens. And at this point in our technology, we really are not ready yet to really say definitive things about that wiring. So the biology is very nice and enticing, but boy, we're looking at the brain through Galileo's telescope as opposed to the Webb thing. So our methods are relatively primitive, and to think that the brain's things will give us the answer is way premature, and that notion actually has had a very devastating effect on our field, to my mind, because people lost sight of mental processes. How does this person think? What does this person's internal reality look like? The DSM doesn't capture that. It has to do with mental flexibility. It has to do with understanding other people's point of view. It's being able to negotiate interpersonal differences. It's being able to determine what's relevant and what's not relevant. And it's in those areas that mental disorders take place, in mental processes. But we have stopped studying that. We need to go back there. I think psychedelics is a golden opportunity to go back to study mental processes.
You talk about how certainly with MDMA or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, one can almost process trauma that they're holding or memories or processes. Do you think it can actually open up those critical pathways to add inner enrichment in impoverished minds or people who have never had those, to lay down new imprints? Do you think that's what you've been seeing?
That's what, I hear still a little bit of, what's the neural circuitry? Someday we will be able to fill out the neural circuitry, but I can't say enough that our clinical observations are much sharper than what any brain scanner can tell you.
Right.
And, great inspiration for me was studying with Pat Ogden and Peter Levine, body people. There's no research on body therapies because it would be so hard to measure with our current technology, but they have videotapes. And videotapes are evidence. And so you can track the way that people move their bodies and the way that people breathe. You can hook them up to autonomic nervous system. So you can see how people's bodies respond. And that's what we see. And so we're looking at mental processes. And indeed what we see is that on psychedelics, people are able to take in novel realities. They're able to take in new perspectives. And it's enough to stay there and not have to go, there's a little circuitry between the amygdala and the hippocampus. That's taking it on a deeper level of ignorance. You know what I mean?
I like that you focus on the imagery, to almost the photographs or the recordings, because when I did the MAP study, the images of the subjects before and after, it was beyond all the measures. They just looked like human beings. They'd come to, it was so dramatic.
Yeah. And I'm sure that if we did Rorschachs, we'd find that people perceive the world differently. And their perspectives change. And, and you see, I feel the culture that you live in, particularly in New York maybe, is a culture that your rational mind determines these things. But, when you do psychedelics, there's nothing rational about it. And it's not like you don't have insights. maybe you'd like to say, oh yeah, I've had a bunch of insights on psychedelics. But it's not really about insights. It's about just something gets churned up, something gets moved around, something you get stand from a different perspective. It's not like, I suddenly realized that. Well, no, do you see that? I don't really see that. You see,
much more impressions and different kind of new experience or textures. Even it's
right, textures. See, it's on on the sub precortical level. So again, that's why it's so great to work with babies and small children, because they don't have language either yet, and you see them go through amazing changes. Not because they understand something, because something gets rearranged in their little minds, so they get to understand. Oh, I need to walk, or if I push that, it will fall, or if I pull that dog with the tail, it will bite me. Like to understand connections, and these are it's a growth in understanding, and that's what I see in psychedelics is that people just get a radically new perspective and go like, "Oh, that poor kid." Wasn't it? A lot of the therapists like to say to our patients, which is probably a good thing to do, it wasn't your fault. Because when you're abused as a kid, you always feel this is happening to me because I'm a bad kid. And sometimes a patient may say, oh, thank you very much, that you think it wasn't my fault. But I still believe it's my fault. This is not something that's rational. Or if you tell people it wasn't your fault, that, oh, good to know, it's not my fault, it goes away. No, it's a very core attitude, orientation that doesn't go away by understanding. And then you have an experience on psychedelics, and you go like, oh, that poor kid, he was so small. Look what happened to him. So somebody should have held him. Somebody should have smiled at him and say, I'm so glad you are living with us. And so you can, on psychedelics, you can sort of concoct on a deep, imaginal, experiential, but not so much verbal level, new realities for yourself.
Bessel, if you could design any psychedelic psychotherapy study, what questions would you like to answer? What would you want to include in it?
Oh, first of all, I would like to have, if we come to reports, we should ask people's co-workers, relatives, kids to do the reporting. Mm-hmm. For example, let me give you an example. First time I took ketamine at a high dose in very nice surroundings, very nice people, and I was blown into the outer universe, and I felt like I was in 2001, that movie, 2001, The Space Odyssey, hurling through the universe, seeing colors, seeing shapes, not feeling my body, not feeling my mind. And I just had this experience of, but I lost my mind, and I like my mind. And so I missed my mind as I was flying through the universe. And then I didn't feel my body, and I actually like my body. It's a little stiff and all, but still I like it. And I missed having my body. And so I came down and said, well, this is an experience. Doesn't mean much to me. And my wife says that I became such a more tolerant, gentle, and loving person. I have no idea. I would not be able to tell you that. She says I did. I'll take a word for it, but and so we're very poor judges ourselves, huh? And so you need to evaluate these things on a deeper level, and indeed look at patterns of behavior. Right? How do you negotiate your conflict with other people? How do you see other people's point of view and don't feel threatened by it? How do you make a plan? So you measure executive functioning, which we can do these days. You measure impulse inhibition, which you can do these days. If I do brain scans, I would look at how the salience and the executive networks of the brain gets changed. Because these are networks that change. Of how are you able to focus on what's relevant? And I would certainly include a workshop.
Thank you. And also thank you for sharing your experience. We don't have too much time, but I would love to ask you, You are such a famous writer and you had such an impact on psychiatry, psychology, and popular culture. It's kind of a mind-blowing experience to have the success and cultural recognition of your book. What has that been like for you? Could you have ever imagined such an experience? To me, that seems like the most mind-blowing, mind-manifesting experience. What has that done for you? What is that like?
No, if anything, it has made me more modest. I hope people don't laugh too loud when I say that. In that, it's a good book, but I read many other books that I think are better written. When I sold my first 1,000,000 copies, I asked my publisher, does that mean that I'm now ready for the Nobel Prize in Literature? And my publisher said, yeah, it's about as likely as Donald Trump is to get the Nobel Prize in Peace, which I think was very true, actually. So I'm delighted by it. And I also actually don't know how much impact it has. I think it has shored up a lot of people. I think it has guided a lot of people. And for that, I'm just very grateful. But I don't take it all that personally. I'm still who I am. I'm still the same flawed creature that I always was. And if anything, I am more aware than ever how much people are struggling with and how hard it is to actually get good treatment and to get the care you need. And so, of course, it's very nice, particularly at my age, when irrelevance becomes a very important issue, that at this point the world still finds me a relevant human being, which is a nice thing. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, just in listening to you today, a lot of the pieces that you really focus on, imagination, creativity, flexibility, I feel like your book functions in that way to the reader. It actually functions very much like a psychedelic and I think actually on all these different levels. So it's quite remarkable to hear you go back and forth.
It's very much based on when I was a medical student or in college. I read a book called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden by Frida von Reichmann. And I just thought it was a beautiful book. And I thought, I want to become a psychiatrist and do what she does. And since the time I've been on admissions committee of all 3 medical schools in Boston, and I always ask students, what books have you read that have really inspired you? And in the last 15 years, not a single medical student had read a book that inspired them to go into psychiatry. And so what I hope to do in this book is if a college student would pick this up and would go like, holy shit, this is the most interesting stuff you can do with your life. Look at all these complexities, I'm going to do this for a living. And I think it has had some of that effect, actually. Yeah.
Absolutely. And are you working on another book?
We have been working on another book for a long time, and it sort of keeps lingering. It's called Come to Your Senses, and it's very much about how to access your body sensations, your body awareness. I don't think it's going to be the big international bestseller the last book was, but it should make a small contribution. Yeah.
And last question, how can the audience learn more about your work?
Well, we have quite a large organization called the Trauma Research Foundation. So if you go to the web, www.traumaresearchfoundation.org, you can see all this stuff that we do. We post a lot of lectures and workshops on how to regulate people, how to regulate yourself, how to do theater, how to do neurofeedback. So we're basically very much an organization that tries to highlight effective treatments, try to support research in stuff you wouldn't get funded for otherwise, and to really show people about all the different things that people are doing that might be helpful for their mental welfare. Yeah.
Bessel, it's been a pleasure being in conversation. You're absolutely delightful. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Gita. See you soon. Bye.